Welcome again, everybody. And I'm going to let Bill explain what NWSOFA is, and then David and I will take the lead on going through the slides for the meeting.
Well, I'll start off. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining tonight. NWSOFA stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action, and we're an indivisible chapter. We are not NWSOFA, which we get called a lot. We were started about 11 years ago, right after Barack Obama won his second term. There was a group of 17 of us that got together at a Panera Bread, and we said, what should we do? We've been making calls for Obama. What's next? And we decided that we would start a group to further some social issues. We didn't quite know what. I'm going to fast forward and tell you that we now have 10 issue teams. We have a leadership group of 24 folks, all non-paid, all volunteers, to help us put on these presentations. And we have a membership just slightly over 5,200 from our 6 township area. So one of the issue groups, the second one, I believe, is our fiscal and economic group. And it has been mentored excellently by Karl Faulstich and David Doney, who are the 2 co-leads. They do an excellent job. It's designed to be a conversation about the economy, but they put a lot of stuff up here for us to really think about, tie a lot of things together. Karl, back to you.
Obviously, this is the meeting. Different topics today are the labor market, last year in review, inflation, wages, other economic statistics, myth busting, and then action. Job creation, which tends to be, something that we pay attention to a lot, it used to be something the Republicans paid attention to a lot until they started realizing that Biden's job creation totally surpasses theirs. But anyhow, last month we added 216,000 jobs. They made adjustments to all kinds of things last year in the last month's data. They reported we added 216,000 jobs in December, but with adjustments to October, November, it was only a net add of 145,000 jobs. But we've got the Trump peak pre-pandemic was at 152.4 million jobs, and we're currently at 157.2. So just about 5 million more jobs, 4.9 million more jobs versus the pre-pandemic peak.
Karl, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I was challenged at a discussion the other day when I mentioned that the Biden economy, the administration had created 14,000 new jobs. They said, well, those aren't new jobs. Those are just the jobs that they had before. How would you answer that comment?
Well, in some cases that's true, and in some cases it's false. I mean, some of the jobs that were around 4 years ago have gone away. My favorite Chinese restaurant no longer does in-restaurant dining. They're totally carry-out delivery business, and so the wait staff and all is all gone. So those are jobs that disappeared, but we have more Grubhub drivers, et cetera, and food delivery that are new jobs that were not there pre-pandemic. We have a lot more Amazon drivers now.
I think that where that guy's coming from, because I run into these people all the time on Twitter, they've been programmed to say all of the Biden jobs are recovered jobs, as if we haven't hit that Feb 20 peak yet, that we're sort of on that. You can see there on the graph how it's sort of climbing up toward the dotted line. That talking point has been outdated since June of 2022. So it's a year and a half stale. We're 5 million jobs above Trump's best. And that's sort of the answer I would give him, is we're 5 million jobs above Trump's best month. That's where we are. We're at 157.2. His best month was 152.4. 5 million jobs above. Now that talking point you could argue was true until you see where the graph, where the blue line hits the dotted line. So in that June, July 2022 period there, that's where we regained the pre-pandemic peak, and everything since then has been so-called new jobs or above net new jobs above that peak. So yeah, they were telling the truth until June 2022. And now the narrative has changed. And as we'll tell you in a couple slides, no matter when you start talking or when you start calculating Biden's job creation as a monthly average, it's faster than Trump.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is job growth by month and a 3-month average showing that job growth has been trending down as we fully recovered the jobs that were lost in the pandemic. But at the same time, we're still seeing job growth that's above the level necessary to stay even. So it's still a good positive economy, a growing economy, and why we keep getting more jobs than Trump ever had. I think this is what David was referring to. In Obama's second term, we averaged 216,000 jobs a month. Trump pre-pandemic, his first 3 years, I guess, we averaged 182,000 jobs a month. All 4 years of Trump, we averaged a loss of 56,000 jobs a month because we handled that pandemic so well. Biden, from inauguration, we've averaged 408,000 jobs added per month. From June of 22, when we got back to Trump's highest level pre-pandemic, we've still been averaging 268,000 jobs a month, which is faster than about any president except maybe Clinton. And these are the unemployment rates. The U3 rate, and I apologize because I say this every meeting, but the U3 rate is people who have not worked in the prior month and have looked for a job in the prior 4 weeks that haven't found one. The U6 rate is all of those people plus people who haven't worked but have looked in the prior year, also people who are working part-time who want full-time jobs.
Is the U3, is that the one that hits the news all the time?
Yes, that's the one that's typically reported. The U6 is sometimes reported. And obviously in the pandemic, we lost 22 million jobs in 2 months. The unemployment rates jumped way up high and have been coming down since then, the end of the Trump term, and then to today. Well, last month, not today. And there are 2 surveys that the BLS does every month. One is the establishment survey, which is the payroll jobs, and the other is the household survey, which has more jobs than the payroll jobs, but because it includes 1099 workers, Lyft and Uber drivers, Grubhub drivers, anybody that's not an actual payroll employee, but is earning money. So nannies and babysitters typically fall into those categories. What we see is that last month, the numbers got a little skewed. Even though the unemployment rate was unchanged, the labor force shrunk, or the number of people employed shrunk after seasonal adjustments. And I think this is a function, and this is Karl guessing, that historically, Marshall Fields and everybody would hire on a bunch of employees for the Christmas season to sell in the stores. And there wasn't as much of that this year because people are ordering stuff online. And so the growth in enrollment seasonally didn't happen to the extent it had in years past. So we'll see what happens to these numbers in a couple of months as that seasonality thing goes away. And here we see that the establishment surveys where we get the payroll jobs, household surveys, we get the total level of employment, which includes those gig 1099 jobs. Each person counted only once. On the payroll survey, people can be counted more than once. The establishment survey tends to have less variability between when the numbers come out and when the final numbers come out. And historically, payroll jobs and total employment has tended to move together. That has, since January 2022, they seem to have split up apart, and we'll see what happens going forward. Employment to population ratio, 25 to 54-year-olds is prime age worker. These people tend to be out of school and pre-retirement. Now, I know that there's some students that are over age 25, and there's some retirees that are under age 54, and good for them, but they're not a large percentage of the population. And so we see is that the employment to population ratio, which got to 80.5% prior to the pandemic, crashed during the pandemic, came back And this past year or last year was mostly above the pre-pandemic level. And what we've got is, it got as high as 80.7%, but then it's the last few months, it's gone down a little bit, and it's unclear, is that permanent or is that a seasonality thing? And I'm not sure. And now we have the JOLT survey, which is job openings compared to unemployment. What we see is that the blue line here is the number of people unemployed, which went up by 20 million or so in early 2020 with the pandemic. It has gone down. We've got job openings, which were fairly low. They were, prior to the pandemic, they were a little bit higher than the unemployment rate, and that didn't fully recover to that, to where that happened again until 2021. So what we have is a ratio of job openings to the unemployed, which got as high as 2.0 and is now at 1.4, which is just a little bit higher than pre-pandemic. I'm going to check the chat and see if there's questions there I should be answering before we move on to the next section.
I've been answering some of the questions, Karl. I think we're current. And one of the questions was, how do you counter the argument that Biden's economy is just riding on the momentum of Trump? First of all, Trump rode Obama's momentum. You can draw lines of almost all the key variables coming through the end of Obama's second term or his last couple of years. They continue pretty much the same way into the Trump era. Trump accelerated the growth a little bit, probably by his tax cuts, but he also added to the deficits versus what he had inherited. So he just, as people used to say, he threw a little bit of gasoline on the fire with his tax cuts, and the fire got a little higher. But then his momentum was completely broken by the pandemic. I mean, you had 20-something million people lost their jobs, and we sort of had to start rebuilding from there. And that took some time. I mean, it also took a lot of money. The deficits became enormous in that post-pandemic era. You had $3 trillion. We used to have $1 trillion deficits, even less, more like $600-700 billion toward the end of the Obama era. And then in Trump, with the pandemic, you had 2 years of $3 trillion deficits. Fiscal 20 and fiscal 2021 were enormous, just to keep the economy from going off a cliff, keep people whole. And those efforts were successful. Fiscal policy worked incredibly well, putting money in pockets, did exactly what you could expect, and the economy got back on track. And we'll share some slides with you later that most of the things that are going on under Biden right now are better than expected. Just before Biden came in, there were forecasts from the CBO and others, and Biden has, the economy has outperformed those.
And, Trump's tax cuts may have stimulated the economy and kept him from being a disaster, but his first 3 years pre-pandemic, we averaged 500,000 fewer jobs a year than at the end of the Obama's second term. So it's not, he didn't totally keep up the Obama trend. Okay. Any new questions before
We've got one on the, are the jobs equivalent pre and post-pandemic? That is, can gig economy jobs be considered equal to payroll jobs? So did the quality of job drop off, after the pandemic? Are we in a lower quality job era now than we were?
Well, remember that the payroll jobs are up, and the gig economy jobs are not up that much at this point. The important thing to look at, we'll look at in a bit, is how much the payroll jobs are being paid. And there's some funky things going on with those that we'll cover on later in this presentation, mainly due to the fact that it was lower level jobs that were lost during the 2 months back in 2020. And here we have jobs by year, average monthly job creation by year, and we see that it was a little bit higher under Obama than Trump's first 3 years. His fourth year was not so good. Biden's years have come in and, they're going down, but they're still higher than the Obama and Trump years. They're similar to Carter years and a little bit under Clinton years, because everyone knows that we had great job creation under Carter. I don't know if we still have that slide in here or not.
But Carter is the champion. Carter, in terms of the job creation rate during his term of office, cumulatively adding the percentage of jobs, the most percent jobs added He's the champ. I think it's Clinton number 2 and then Reagan. Is that right? Depends on how you look at it, but Clinton and Reagan were very close, but Carter's number 1.
In terms of just raw numbers of jobs added, Clinton's number 1, Carter's 2, and Reagan trails the field because I think it's like Carter added 215,000 jobs per month and Reagan added 168,000. Now, both of them had the same real GDP growth of 3.4%. Anyhow, unemployment rate average for the year, we see that it went down under Trump until the pandemic hit, and it's been going down under Biden. So Trump continued to trend. Since we started tracking the unemployment rate back in the early 1930s, name all the Republican presidents who saw the unemployment rate go down between the beginning of their term and the end of their term. And the answer is Reagan. And that's the end of the list. And every Democratic president has seen the unemployment rate go down between the beginning of the term and the end of their term since the early 1930s, although it was tiny change under Carter. He added a lot of jobs, but there were a lot of women entering the workforce and minorities. And so the workforce was growing and the labor force was growing and the number of jobs grew. But the unemployment stayed fairly constant between the beginning of his term and the end of his term. It only went down marginally. Okay, we see the Black unemployment rate or the African American unemployment rate, which Trump really focused on the fact that he had the all-time low back in 2018 or 2019 and was actually trending up before the pandemic hit. Not quite sure why, but it actually last year was lower than Trump's all-time low. So the African American unemployment rate is still higher than the overall rate as we have more jobs, tighter economy, more opportunities for minorities. Employment to population ratio, again, this is prime age workers, and pre-pandemic, it was pretty high under Trump. Then it dropped down. Are these both 2019 numbers, David? I'm guessing this might be 2020, but during the pandemic, but maybe not. It looks like it is pre-pandemic, beginning of the year, end of the year. So there were some issues with the Trump economy faltering prior to the pandemic, some weakness. And now we see better numbers on the employment to population ratio. And this employment to population ratio is real important when you start listening to the Illinois Policy Institute talk about how Illinois has a relatively high unemployment rate. Is counter to that, we have a relatively high employment to population ratio. The percent of our people that are employed is higher than almost all the states. So,
sorry, Karl, I ran downstairs to get some food. These ratios are average for the year. So I just averaged all the monthly observations in Excel. So that's why. Now the year, I have a bad label there, don't I? That's 2020.
That was my question.
Yeah, that was an obviously bad label. That's the depth of the pandemic was, well, I shouldn't say the depth, but 2020 was the lowest annual average. And we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but when people compare to when Biden took office, there are a lot of nuances to every single number that are there. And that's why I always tell people the most fair comparison is like an annual average 2023 versus 2019. You get rid of all the distortion when you do that. That was in 2020 and 2021. But even, major media sources, they will throw, this number's down since Biden started, and they do a terrible job putting that in context. It really drives me crazy. And a couple of the economists that I follow on Twitter, we were chatting. One of them I was chatting with yesterday, and he does all these fact checking and corrections for the Washington Post. He always puts it out on Twitter and a newsletter that they do out of the Center for Economic Policy Research, the EPR. And he just goes nuts like I do when the Washington Post says real wages are down under Biden. And it's like, geez, people and they don't say that they were the highest ever in 2021. They don't tell you that. They just tell you they're down, and we'll tell you the numbers on those charts, but sorry, this is a bad label. That's 2020.
Okay, fair enough. This is where you talk about wages. And we see that Trump's last year average wage for production non-supervisory employees, which doesn't include executives, was $28.40, inflation adjusted. The last year under Biden it was $29.25. Now what we see is right, the average wage exploded because lower wage workers lost their jobs. And if you averaged, 10, 20, 30, and 40, you get a number 25, I think. And if you take out all the $10 an hour workers, when you did this number then jumps up higher to 30. And that's what we had, is that you had a lot of low wage workers lost their jobs, have been rehired, but at the end of the day, they're rehired at a higher wage than they were before. Because a lot of people got raises and real raises during the downturn since the start of the pandemic. I think I saw a graphic the other day that said something like 58% of the people, or something like that, close to 60, are making a higher wage after inflation than they were a year ago. And 40 some have had a real increase of over 5%. But that still left, 40% or so that did not keep up with inflation. The averages, there are anecdotal stories and anomalies that are true, that some people did not keep up with inflation last year, even though on average people did.
And that translates to about $1,000 an hour. I'm sorry, not an hour, $1 an hour, about $1,000 a year per worker in more purchasing power now than in 2019. That's from a Treasury study that just came out last couple of weeks. So that's $1,000 more purchasing power. So despite inflation, people have that extra power, that purchasing power to buy stuff, which is part of why the economy has been booming.
But that's the average, not everybody. So here we've got real hourly wages, inflation adjusted since 64. Interestingly, we've got a ramp up until 73, and then real wages crashed and went down because inflation was high. We also had, we had two things. We had a lot of women entering the workforce, and they tended to be paid less. And then we also had a lot of foreign trade that happened. I think I probably told this story before. My dad worked for Caterpillar, and in the 60s, when we drove around the country, all the construction set equipment we saw was Caterpillar equipment. And as we got into the 70s, we started seeing some Japanese Komatsu equipment working on the roads in the US. And, that's also when we started getting some of the foreign cars being sold here in the US to a greater extent than they were before.
And those, let me just mention the annual averages for a second, just to accentuate that point. Biden has the record now for the highest real wages for a year, 2021, $29.53. And so you can say, and I see this all the time in the media, real wages are down since Biden took office. Yes, $29.53 is higher than $29.25, the 2023 number in the right side of this is the second graph there. But $29.25 is higher than 2019, as we shared before. And 2023 is the, third highest year on record. So when people complain about real wages being down as a negative for Biden, they don't put in the perspective of the level. They're just talking about the change and not the fact that it's extremely high historically, 97th percentile or so, higher than 97% of historical observations. It's a very high number, and very strong purchasing power is nothing to dock the president for, especially when you consider that 2021 was likely very distorted by the pandemic. So that's why, if you put it in context, you can say, hey, 2021 was the highest year ever. Nobody says that. You only hear it here. Never heard it anywhere else but here. But there's, but at the same time, it's kind of irrelevant. It's really 2019 that matters, because the 2020 and 21 were distorted by those people losing their jobs. All right, Karl, go ahead.
Okay, I see a question in the chat about how do gig workers figure into these, and the short answer is they don't. That these are all payroll employees, and so it's from the establishment survey of payroll employees. I don't know that I've seen anything that's just average wages of gig employees from any. It would be in the Census Bureau numbers overall, but I'm not sure where we would see them separated out. Okay, real GDP growth rates. Obama first term, second term, average 2.2%. Trump pre-pandemic 2.84%. overall 2%. Biden through the third quarter is at 2.83%, and we'll see where he ends up. And household net worths have gone up, partially due to benefits passed under and signed under Trump, partially due to benefits signed under Biden. So we see is at the bottom 50% of the households, their net worth has gone from 36,000 to 55,000. And for the 50 to 90th percentile groups, we see it's gone from 721,000 to 830,000. And we see here is that the top wealth group fell during 2022 because the stock markets lost a lot of money in 2022, and then they've gone up in 2023. A very confusing graph taken from the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, defines a recession, and this is how they define it. And they look at certain particular metrics, a couple of the biggest of which they look at are non-farm payrolls and overall household employment. So only payrolls and including gig workers. And what we see is that almost all of these indicators have gone up since Biden took office. This group has not ruled that we're in a recession. There does not appear to be any indication that they're going to rule we're in a recession this year. I won't rule out the fact that, even though many of the economists that were guaranteeing a recession last year are now saying we're not going to have a recession this year. Last year showed that their guarantees aren't worth much. Something could happen to cause things to go south. We could end up in an expanded Middle East war against Iran. We could end up with access to the Suez Canal and traffic through the Panama Canal going way down. Could have a negative impact on the economy. The Suez Canal is due to Iranian-backed folks targeting shipping in the Red Sea, and the Panama Canal is due to a drought that dropped the water level, which restricts how many ships can go through at any given time. So there are no guarantees in life, but historically, there's nothing that indicates that we are heading for a recession anytime soon.
Nor does would a recession have to be bad? I mean, the Fed has a lot of room to cut interest rates down to zero, and also can stop selling bonds, taking money out of the system. They have a lot of ability to make any recession very shallow. I mean, the unemployment rate might go up to 4.3. It's not going to 9, like we saw in the Great Recession, or the Great Recession was even a little higher than that. So it's not. There is no reason to fear a slowdown. It's a media creation. They want news. And when inflation got better, they struggled to figure out what the next thing should be, and that was fear of recession. And they had enough economists to tell them that normally what happens when the Federal Reserve does what it does is you do get a recession. They figured that to kill off inflation, you would need to have higher unemployment and really slow down the economy. And it turns out that diagnosis was probably wrong. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but it's the idea that is the traditional view on the demand side. If you have crazy high levels of demand, then you need to take money out of people's pockets to slow it down and get people to stop spending or businesses from investing. But if it's the supply side, if it is really that people were disrupted by the pandemic and only now are able to ramp up production to meet with the higher demand that we have now, then you don't need to worry about that. And I think that's where Paul Krugman is coming from, and other economists are starting to realize that a lot of this was supply, not just demand. And so that idea that you must trade off unemployment and inflation wasn't true in this particular case.
And then, of course, the other reason I'm fairly confident we won't have a recession is 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republican presidents. The last one that didn't was a short 6-month recession under Carter, 5 or 6 months. And before that, there was a recession under Truman. But if you want a recession, elect a Republican president, because the last Republican president that did not have a recession start on his watch was James Garfield, who served 6 months in 1881 before he died from an assassin's bullet. basically you can pretty much guarantee a recession under a Republican president. I'd like to see that string drop and end if and when we ever elect another president. And this is just how those economists did predicting what would happen in 2023. Real GDP growth they thought was going to be minimal, fraction of 1%. And in fact, it is closer to 3%. And the 2024 forecast is down to 1.25%. And we'll see whether that ends up being true or not. But you basically see that pretty much all of these, what happened in terms of actual was much better than what was the forecast for next year is, and we've got the federal budget deficits. Again, fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th. Trump budgeted fiscal years 2018 to 2021. Fiscal year 2021 started 4 months before the end of the presidential term. Well, not quite 4 months. October 1st of 2020 to January 20th of 2021. And we've got the budget deficit is around 1.6 trillion, down from the peak of the last Trump years. And it's interesting to note that when President Trump took office, the forecast was that the deficits were going to go down for a couple more years. But between his tax cuts and his spending increases, the deficit increased and were just under $1 trillion prior to the pandemic hitting. And we're forecasting the fiscal year 2020 was going to be over $1 trillion before the pandemic hit. But then the pandemic hit, the CARES Act was, what was it, 1.9 trillion in spending, and then another 900 billion in his act in December 2020 that he signed. So Trump signed a lot of the stimulus bills that affected these.
Yeah, so far this year. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Karl.
And I was just going to say, David notes in a note that the student loan forgiveness, which was announced in September of 2022, negatively affected the 2023 fiscal year, and then it was a deduction in fiscal year 2024, I guess, or may have those years wrong. Anyway, you were going to say, David?
Yeah, I mean, just what you said is right. It was 2022 where Biden got dinged. They assigned that expense to 2022, and then they took it out of 2023. And that's why these numbers look very smooth, like they're all right around the 1.5 trillion range. If you pretend that never happened, then what you get is you get a deficit that was more like $1 trillion in 2022. It's actually unusually low. And then 2023 was unusually high. Still trying to understand exactly why 2023 was so high, because there wasn't a giant stimulus package in fiscal 2023. Revenues were lower than they expected. We'll see what happens in 2024. But through the first quarter of 2024, the deficit's running about 50 billion higher than it did in 2023. So if you assume that, you can't assume this, but if you were to multiply that by 4, you're looking at a deficit that's only 200 or 300 billion higher than this year. So somewhere, instead of that 2024 forecast being like 1.6, that's the May forecast. In 2023, that's the latest one we have from CBO. They're about to give us a new one. It's probably more like 2 trillion deficit in 2024, where it's likely to be. Beats the giants of 2020 and 2021, but it is odd that these deficits are still as high as they are. I just don't have my arms around why they're running so big.
Well, part of it is going to be capital gains taxes. The stocks crashed in 2022, so there were fewer capital gains to tax. Those capital gains taxes would have gotten paid in 2023 had they existed, which may have popped the deficit higher in 2023. Capital gains were higher in 2023, which means that the 2024 deficit may end up around what's being predicted. But we'll see, because I expect within the next month or two, CBO will come out with its next projections, and we'll see what they are.
Yeah, we'll cover that in the next meeting. We probably will get that CBO report, not the next meeting, the one after. We'll get that soon. It's usually like mid-January or through mid-February, somewhere in there, we'll get it, their big annual report, which we go into in detail. But just so you know, though, because the GDP is growing so fast, I mean, you always hear the real GDP, the inflation-adjusted number. You can add the inflation rate to that, and that gives you the nominal number. The nominal GDP is growing so fast that the overall debt ratio has actually been falling a little bit since the Trump peak there, and I think it was 2020 or 2021. It's actually come down from there, and that is probably a better measure of how much the so-called debt weight is on the economy, is the debt to GDP ratio, more than these numbers. Because if you go back 30 or 40 years, these deficit numbers were tiny. And Clinton actually had a deficit. He balanced the budget around 2000, and 98 to 2000, those fiscal years all had balanced budgets. And so that was zero. But just because they're a certain size doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. And people saying, "Oh my God, it's the end of the world because there's 34 trillion in debt." Don't let numbers fool you. You got to look at the percentages. You almost have to divide by something to have a meaningful number. And that's why we use this percentage GDP line on here to see what's going on with how high is that deficit. Really, it's high, but the economy can handle it. There is no crisis. Interest rates are higher because of what the Fed is doing. The long-term interest rates are not a crazy high number that the government can't borrow or anything. There is no fiscal crisis, but it's another part of what the hysteria that the right wing tries to create, in this sense of things are out of control, the things that there's this sense of doom out there. And that's something that is directly cultivated by the propaganda on the right. And the fact is, the economy is fine. There is no emergency, and it's doing just great on all these different numbers. And you're up against it because the media, when you think about it, they would really love to have Trump back because he's big money for them. They made huge profits when he was in office with all the drama that he creates. And so we're up against not just the complexity of trying to explain the story, we're also up against a right-wing media complex, and our left-wing, all the media has really got an interest in Trump coming back in, and we got to battle that. It's an uphill battle.
Okay.
Now we're going to try to hand off here.